So I'm interested in how Mars is used in science fiction by different authors at different times. I think it's interesting that Mars as a sort of planetary location is probably almost certainly the most common place that sci-fi novels go, probably more than the moon, in fact, I would guess. And the fact that there are so many different approaches to how Mars is used, and the fact that that literature about kind of Martian sci-fi has been being published for so long, over such a long period. You know, I've got a century's worth in my hands here. I find that interesting. I find it interesting as a recurring topic, and I find it interesting it's flexible. I think a sign of flexibility in the tradition, I guess is the phrase I'd use, is precisely that something the same element or concept can be moved into different places and pushed in different ways. So I've got six authors here, and there are many others, but six I have read who have dealt with Mars. In roughly chronological order, we've got John Carter, which is by Edgar Rice Burroughs. So that's the first 10 John Carter novels. Then we have C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet. And then at about the same time, in the early 50s, I think for both of them, or maybe very late 40s for this, Sword of Rhiannon by Lee Brackett, and The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. And then more recently, 90s, Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, The Martian by Andy Weir, online publication 2011, self-published 2013, so within 10 years. That's a big range of writing. Now, there are two main ways. What I'm going to do is I think I'll just say the sort of subgenres things get written into, and then I want to draw out some of the ways those subgenres or styles of Martian fiction are used to spin a particular story, and then maybe just talk a little bit about how each author uses the idea or theme of Mars in their book. So really, you've got kind of theoretically two subgenres represented here. You've got the more modern, true hard sci-fi, lots of science, lots of facts. That's Weir and Stanley Robinson. It's really realistic, speculative, near future settlement of Mars. This is how the tech might work. Not that they would say, oh, it definitely will work that way, but rather, oh, there's some interesting stuff people are writing about how you might do soil tests on Mars, that kind of thing. Or it might be that this is how we had a long mission to do and how we dealt with the pressure there. Those are specific technical questions. And then you've got Sword and Planet stuff. And that's I'm saying Burroughs by John Carter, Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, and Lee Brackett's Sword of Rhiannon. And three of those, Brackett, Lewis, and Burroughs, all also travel to other places on their Sword and Planet adventures, particularly Venus for all of them, and for Brackett, many other places as well. So you have, they have like shared universes. For Burroughs, he shares it also with his Tarzan and his Hollow World adventures. So you've got and these two main genres, yeah, we've got the hard sci-fi and then you've got the Sword and Planet. And Sword and Planet is adventuring, swashbuckling. Buck Rogers is a later kind of style of that. Adventuring, swashbuckling, a bit like how space opera is to sci-fi as well. It's a more adventure and style-based subgenre than a science-based subgenre. It's trading on drawing tropes from other genres, particularly the adventure story, and the Dumassian Three Musketeers type adventure story, particularly two and things like that, to use this other locale as a realm of adventure rather than as a place to answer specific technical questions in an exciting, interesting way. So those are the two big subgenres you see in a lot of planetary fiction, particularly in Mars fiction. You don't get comparatively much Sword and Planet, and I'm sure there is still Sword and Planet being published now, but it's not a big genre that I see about. You see space opera, which is a different thing, more than Sword and Planet. But I'm sure there will be Sword and Planet about other star systems and worlds and stuff. Certainly Buck Rogers is an example I've used. But in literary terms, our solar system, and particularly Mars, is the big place that happens. The most famous Sword and Planet writer of all starts on Mars. and also goes to Venus in the Carson of Venus books. But it's good. It's well enough to say there are these two subgenres, and I think that's true. I think that's defensible. But these 6 books are unique, and I don't mean that in a particularly precious way. Oh, we don't want to reduce them to being this subgenre. What I mean is they are that subgenre, but they are using those subgenre, subgeneric tropes and ideas and styles and themes to do different things, unique things. They're reformulating again. They're not just taking Mars, they're taking a sub-form of the Mars fiction. One thing to say is there is a reason, a pretty obvious, well, probably set of reasons why we have these Sword and Planety books going up into the early 50s, and then in the 90s and 10s we have hard sci-fi. And the obvious reason really is that the first one we'd think of is, well, we know so much more about Mars than about space. There are, there's no space travel at the point in these, even of functional satellites like extra atmospheric satellites, by the point that Bradbury and Brackett are publishing these particular stories. And so the fact that the Sword and Planet sees Mars as a dying world, a world of canals and of pockmarked craters, we'll get to a couple of twists on that as we go into the authors. But because we see it like that, because that was partly based on the pop science of the time. It's interesting that actually that is not something which these authors believe. They don't believe, the idea that the canals were canals was always disputed, and I don't think by the 50s, off the top of my head, that people really widely thought that it was proof of settlement on Mars. And certainly, that's something we would feel more confident about now in terms of life like ours. Hard sci-fi, on the other hand, is relying on a much more photographic and detailed and sample-based, both in terms of photographs but also landers, orbital tests and lander tests, on what Mars actually is, right? And that makes a difference to the kinds of facts you can talk about, but it also makes a difference. This is the second level, and the two intertwine. It is not all one is a cause, one is the effect. There's a mix. It also helps impact upon the imagination, the imaginative faculty, and the way in which you think about the world. I've talked about this when I've talked about Lewis and Planet Narnia, but there is something where the modern mind progressively, from the Renaissance onwards, but particularly once we're into space, takes on a particular cast about how it sees the sky, which is really interesting. It's not one note, but where we have a simultaneous, fascinating combination of sort of terror at the limitlessness of space and the aridity of space, the complete inhospitality of space. But also we're excited by the prospects of new worlds, strange new worlds, new life. And that's something which is, finds, in terms of cometh the TV show, cometh the moment, meeting in Star Trek, where these two smash together at the right time, and you suddenly have this vision of hope, of JFK-like aspirational Western hope being put out into the stars. And there are probably links there, incidentally, to literally the Western as a genre, which is, though it is in Sword and Planet, is much less strong as an influence than it will be in, this is the point about space opera, it's a Western influenced form of sci-fi. The Sword and Planet is much more adventure novel influenced. But yeah, so you've got that dichotomy and that bifurcation at some level in time based on our knowledge of Mars, or our understanding of our knowledge of Mars. In fact, it's a second order thing. It's what we process that information as. One thinks of the fact that Lewis, who I'll talk about, does say a star, when the discussion is, well, isn't a star just a ball of gas? And the character is told that it is a ball of gas, but not just a ball of gas. Things have layers of meaning. So yes, that's the reason for the bifurcation, the subgenres, and it gives us clues towards the kinds of stories that we're told. you'll probably be more likely to find inhospitable, survival-based things, as well as aspirational things in the hard sci-fi genre. You'll be more likely to find different kinds of stories in Sword and Planet. So I'll go through how each of these, well, in fact, let's expand on that point and then we'll go into the individual books. Particularly with Sword and Planet, you see a few complex themes come up in how it uses Mars. It's important to say that the way that all of these authors, who you go to other planets, I bracket Lewis and Burroughs, they use Venus in a different way, completely different way, and it's relevant to say that therefore there's a different genre of Venus books, and the Venus Sword and Planet trope is different to the Martian one. But all of these authors present Mars at some level as a damaged or dying world, and what you accomplish via that is a comparison to a fertile Earth, the idea of something that could happen to Earth, or giving a degree of the seeing of Ozymandias in the sand with his the shattered feet of the statue sticking out, the idea of mutability and change and things that pass. Those are things that the Sword and Planet Mars does, and it's interesting because though you get that idea of there's this ancient world, and the Martian actually, that's a regular thing about it's so old that has that. The idea of it being about mutability and change and at some level reflecting upon human ambitions is not really there very much. Even in the environmental stuff in Red Mars, where there's environmentalists, radical environmentalists who are like, we shouldn't interfere with Mars anywhere near as much as we are. That is still that is not a reflection of mutability, change, death upon our own lifestyle, but instead it's them saying, look, this is a different thing, this is a strange new world, new life, the final frontier. Whereas in Sword and Planet, the picture is of decay. There are caveats to that, and I want to go through those, but just to compare the two there. How do these individual authors use them though? Because it is not that I have here, well, technically 13, but 4 books that are really about Mars is a decaying place where you have interesting musketeer-like adventures. The modern stuff though, that's all about just technical questions. These are all very different books by very different authors. Burroughs, you have an incredibly prolific author, a serial author. You have an author who writes pretty straight adventures. John Carter in these ones is transported to Mars and lives out a life there. Carson of Venus, does he crash on it? I'm trying to remember. You've got this kind of pretty straight, simple setups, almost silly setups, and then the adventures are, they go around having an adventure, isn't it? An amazing adventure. And this is good, honest fun, isn't it? There's depth to Burroughs, which is underappreciated. There is a genuine degree of querying, satirically querying things on Earth, speculatively imagining other civilizations. The fact that you have the main species, there are several types of Martian who are like humans. The white and black Martians, for instance, are both human, basically humans. Red Martians, though, they're the human types who John is friends with, and he marries the beautiful Dejar Thoris. But there are also, and you can see this on my cover, these guys, and you'll remember if you've seen the film, you've got the multi-limbed green Martians, the 6-limbed green Martians, including his great friend Tars. And so Carter, there is a speculative thing, there is an adventure thing, but John Carter is good, honest fun, basically. This actually has a review by Ray Bradbury. Wow, I should have planned this video better. Burroughs and his alter ego, John Carter, seized off to Mars by impossible dreams, pulled 10 million boys after them, and changed America's scientific territory forever. It's probably changed more destinies than any other writer in American history. That's an interesting comment, isn't it, on the idea of, nonetheless, this is a upward-looking, outward-looking fiction, particularly for Carter, Burroughs and Carter. But I think that idea that the imagination is expanded by it to see a world of adventure out there, of joy and interest, and it's decaying, and there's a sense of sadness and tragedy at points, but it's an exciting place. That is very much the way that Burroughs, in his boyish way, does things. Lewis, interestingly, he has the fact that the surface is inhospitable and was inhabited in Out of the Silent Planet, where these three characters go, including our hero, Dr. Ransom. But they get there, and the surface is scarred, but that is because of a intergalactic or interplanetary war, where the evil angels of Earth had fought, or rather they caused conflict with Mars, and so the natives now live in the valleys. They live in protected places, and they have a complex, advanced civilization, and so there is a degree of sadness to what's been destroyed. But this is Lewis, who was, as he put it, a jovial figure. He was a jolly chap, and I think you see with Out of the Silent Planet that Mars is scarred, but it is not lost. It may have lost something, but what is lost is regenerated and recreated and rebuilt. So here, it actually Mars as a symbol of decay becomes a symbol of the capacity of vice or sin or cruelty to damage and destroy. It's the idea of the decay of Mars is symbolic of that. For Burroughs, it's simply fun. For Lewis, it becomes a symbol of something else. And of course, the planets are very important to Lewis, and the way in which he's also merging the early scientific view of Mars with the adventure genre and the medieval cosmology that preceded not just our early scientific view of Mars, but our early modern view of the cosmos in general. So Lewis is very different to Burroughs, despite the fact they both have an Earth hero go off to Mars. The Martian Chronicles by Bradbury is completely different. It is Sword and Planet in the sense that it includes a decaying Mars with strange Martians, and the idea of the passing of the old being an important theme. But for Bradbury, this is much more stylized, much more funky. This is not an adventure book. It uses adventure genre tropes of the adventurers or the explorers going places, but it often twists them and turns them tongue-in-cheek. The idea that a guy turns up to a place no one's been, pretty much just so he can start a restaurant to exploit the passing traffic, and he turns it back on Earth. And in this case, Mars as another world that we take our problems to. We cannot escape our problems, and so Mars's decay is actually echoed by decay inside us. The idea also that the Martians may have transcended, or some of them have transcended their old state and such things. The age and decay is a sign not of failure, but of triumph, which we haven't achieved. The idea that the Martian, this is, by the way, exactly the kind of stuff, in a very different mode at points, but that Woolf deals with in Fifth Head of Cerberus. Some of these questions of how we come and meet the other, and how we are changed by the other, and the other is changed by us, and how sometimes you can never unstitch that afterward, but sometimes it becomes mimetically impossible to unstitch it, to even understand the difference. And yes, so this is very effective at that. Bradbury is doing as much philosophy as Lewis, and they both do more than Burroughs, but Burroughs is doing philosophy too, definitely. I speak about that in my review. But Bradbury and Lewis are doing two different kinds of philosophy, or theology, or imaginative morality, but it's both there. The Sword of Rhiannon, this is another twist. Brackett does have a dying Mars in some of her stories. The canals, the dusty canals of Mars, and she does at the start of this. But this book is mostly set in the Martian past, when there are great oceans, great nations, and a really fascinating plot. I have reviewed this. I haven't reviewed Out of the Silent Planet. I've reviewed all the other books that I'm looking at today. But yeah, so Brackett instead says, well, what happens if we just use Mars, this Mars of our imagination, which used to have water and great civilizations? Why don't we just explore that? Not why don't we explore what it would be like now, but why don't we just explore that? There's no issue of inhospitability. There's no issue of of explaining away what's happened. Was it a war that did it? Was it environmental disaster? Instead, you just get to see the cool stuff on this strange world. And so in that sense, it begins to merge a little bit into other sci-fi. It doesn't seem like that Sword and Planet Mars, except that it is extrapolating. It's a double speculation. I think that's actually one reason I think this is such an interesting book. Sort of Rhiannon Lee Brackett. You can also read some of her other books in short stories in various collections. So that's you can see the range you can use the Sword and Planet Dying Mars to look at. It's interesting, of course, the Dying Earth novels of, well, particularly most obviously Vance and Woolf, use some of the same imagery and pictures and the idea of a changed and alien surface, paralleling Earth, and in fact it is Earth, at Moorcock 2 actually, in Dances at the End of Time. They do something that's similar with Earth, but I think yeah, you can see how wide a range of Marses there are, but how they use these same elements and recombine them to I think to great effect. What about the hard sci-fi authors though? There are, again, I'm sure there are other Mars books out there, and I look forward to you recommending them to me. But these two are studying contrast. They are both really good about the inhospitability of Mars, the risks of settlement, the way that we would go there. One is set functionally earlier. I mean, years-wise, I guess they probably match up pretty similarly in terms of when you're meant to be there. But here, this is exploration missions to work out what's going on. The intended stay is for 1 month, but then a storm which risks tipping over the ascent vehicle happens, and so most of the crew go, and they think this guy, Matt Damon, Mark Watney, is dead. So yeah, that's so this is set in an earlier point of the process than this one. This one is the first colonists. So you have 1969, Armstrong becomes the first man on the moon. 2020, John Boone becomes the first man to set foot on Mars. 2027, the first mass landing arrives on Mars. There's a point here that you've got far bigger gaps between missions in The Martian, and between the kinds of missions as well. So they're wanting to terraform a frozen wasteland with no atmosphere into a new Eden. Red Mars, and then Green Mars, and then Blue Mars. That's the trilogy of Martian books, which is a gigantic operatic history of the Martian settlement. And I suppose in that sense the term opera helps us think about this one, because these combine other genres. Doesn't everything combine other genres into the main? The Martian has survival thriller, and which is a kind of, it fits into hard sci-fi perfectly well, and it fits into the idea of the inhospitable Mars that is inhospitable not because it's decaying, but because it's dead, because it's sterile, because it is other and alien, rather than because it is in some way similar, full of people like us, as you see in the Sword and Planet. But yeah, The Martian also pulls in genre tropes from basically comedy, and yeah, the idea of the kind of eccentric explorer or eccentric scientist. So it does that, whereas Red Mars has a very different perspective format. This is first person described mostly. This is third person switching between characters, so it's third person limited, but we get different characters who all have very different voices. Here, the only other characters you get much time on don't really have any different voices to the main character. Here, because it's such a strong main character, here you have a vast cast, and you have a vast spread of time being dealt with, even in the first book, decades I think, and lots of politics and lots of interpersonal tensions and relationships changing and things like that. And so this actually in that sense reflects, maybe more than The Martian, some of those themes from Bradbury of what we take with us. You can actually compare some of that to Ian M. Banks's The Culture, not so much over Mars, but over the idea of what happens when you suddenly have access to lots of other resources. And Banks is very, very sanguine, whereas Robinson and indeed Bradbury, and say something like Babylon 5, the TV series, where Mars, or The Expanse, but where in both cases they're terraforming jobs. In The Expanse, people lose interest because they can eventually go further, In Babylon 5, for a long time, Mars feels like it's being exploited by Earth. You get less sanguine, less positive answers. And Red Mars tries to really worry a lot of that out. It really is like, what are all the different views that we could have on Mars? There are some people who are eco-terrorists. There are some people who are social revolutionaries. There are some people who are, there for a profit. And there is the great fascinating character John Boone. So yes, it is not a coincidence, I think, that Mark Watney goes on Ares 3 and the mass landing on Red Mars is accomplished by the Ares, whereas it reaches orbit. In fact, Ares 3 itself, in terms of the descent and ascent vehicles, are on Mars. This is in orbit. Yeah, so I think you can see that they all do very different things with Mars. In hard sci-fi, though, there are slightly different questions, more ones about human destiny, I think, than in much of the Sword and Planet stuff. Bradbury bridges those two because Bradbury isn't using Sword and Planet as a genuine genre of adventure. It sounds cynical, but I don't mean it cynically. He's saying, look, let's use the form of Sword and Planet and things that people are familiar with, and the idea of Mars that we have as having beings somewhat like us on this decaying, drying planet. And there is one absolutely startling chapter in it which does a bit of that, which, if I can remember, is called Night Meeting, I think. But yeah, absolutely startling chapter, a story in that collection. But the idea that he's like, let's use the form of Sword and Planet and the things we're familiar with to sit back and think, well, what would happen if we went and met people like us? Who are people like us, and how do we deal with them now? How do we deal with opportunities now, if there's all these opportunities of going and settling? And it's natural that's more like the Brave New World stuff that you get with hard sci-fi, not because they're the same thing, but because they're asking similar questions, than it is to the other Sword and Planet, like your Bracketts, your Lewises, your Burrows, who are actually interested in different things. Of course, in all those cases, you see a bit of this question of like, how would we deal with different people? And I think a really obvious example of that is in Lewis, the fact that Ransom is basically a stowaway kidnapped victim or whatever, whilst the other two characters are there up to exploit Mars. They're like, man, if we go and find other aliens, we'll be able to make money out of them. So yes, of course, it's something where Lewis continues exploring that in a very explicit sense through Perelandra, set on Venus, using the idea of Venus as a young planet, a planet of possibility and of growth, and then that hideous strength which deals with Earth and the Moon, which there is a great trilogy. Particularly that hideous strength is one of my favourite novels. So yes, that is what. Just some thoughts about the way that Mars is used in fiction, the way we have subgenres of how Mars is used, the impacts that has on the kinds of stories that are told, or partial impacts, and then I think just some comments from me on how particular authors use it, and therefore the possibilities of those different, imagine they're different building blocks and that can be rearranged. So that's my thoughts on it. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I hope you'll tell me in the comments and recommend other Mars fiction there too. Till next time.